Okay, I think maybe we can go ahead and get started if that sounds good to you, Andrew.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us this morning. This is a Burn Model System National Data and Statistical webinar, part of our webinar series. And today, Dr. Humbert will be presenting on to confound or not to confound, leveraging observational data in the BMS database to emulate randomized trials. So, Andrew, I'll just introduce you and then hand it over. Andrew Humbert, PhD, is the co-principal investigator of the Burn Model System National Data and Statistical Center. He is also an assistant professor at the University of Washington, Department of Rehabilitation Medicine, with 10 years of experience in study design and data analysis in various medical settings. He has conducted analyses from a wide variety of data sources, including clinical trials, medical records, survey data, and large data registries, and has extensive experience using regression techniques for a wide range of data types, including longitudinal, clustered, and survival data. He also provides statistical consulting and collaborates on research conducted by faculty and graduate level students within the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine. Take it away, Andrew. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Kara. As Kara said, when we're talking about kind of this idea of to confound or not to confound, to kind of get at confounding, I guess, through kind of a roundabout way, with the goal of really trying to identify ways to leverage the observational data we have in the Burn Model Systems database to try to emulate randomized kind of trials. And maybe a little bit of a clickbait title in that, I don't think we're ever going to really be able to emulate randomized trials, but we can at least emulate some of the thinking that's done there and trying to kind of come up with as rigorous approaches to our analyses kind of as possible. Um, so just a quick overview on how this presentation is going to be laid out. First, we're just going to start with kind of why randomized trials and really kind of build this up at kind of a big picture level, kind of starting from square one of what's really the benefit to randomized trials and kind of what problems are they trying to solve. We're then going to look at kind of the limitations of observational data as a whole, and then try to identify, potential methods we could use to kind of achieve the same solutions that are accomplished through randomized trials. We're then going to talk about kind of a cautionary tale, in part because I've been waiting to talk about some of these paradoxes that occur in statistics for kind of as long as I've been in statistics. But I also think it's a good example of making sure we really critically think about the models. And when we talk about confounding and trying to emulate clinical trials, what question are we actually trying to answer? And really need to be specific about that question and really critically think about what we do need to do or what we need to avoid doing to try to answer that questions. And this can be greatly aided by the use of directed acyclic graphs. So this is kind of just a visualization method that we'll kind of talk about for understanding kind of pathways for causal effects. And then lastly, we're going to kind of work through a Burn Model Systems example that's at least loosely based on kind of a paper that came out of the Burn Model Systems group. So, motivation, again, kind of, why do we even need kind of clinical trials? What's not the purpose of them? Well, I think it always starts with a question. In this case, I'm just going to come up with a question saying, we want to test some new rehabilitation program in burn survivors to see if it improves long-term outcomes. Right? This is the question we want to answer. And what we're hoping to conclude is that this rehabilitation program, this treatment, has some net benefit in this population. Right. But the kind of the problem number one kind of we face is, we can't treat everyone, right? I mean, they're just logistical barriers. There's limited resources that if we're trying to come up with kind of a new treatment or a new rehabilitation program, we often can't just start by treating absolutely everybody who has kind of a burn injury. So that's kind of the problem number one. And the solution, which probably everybody is, somewhat familiar with at this time, is to just take a sample of the population. We could administer a treatment to that sample, and then we can use statistics to model what would happen in the entire population. And I think this is an important distinction to make, that when we're talking about the goal of kind of statistics in these studies as a whole, it's really to make some conclusion about this entire population here. But to get at kind of the conclusion for that population, all we have is the sample that we draw, right? So we draw a sample from this population, we apply some treatment, and then we try to use some sort of statistics to bring back our conclusions to the entire population as a whole. Because, once we're done treating our sample, the goal is to not stop there, but it's to be able to conclude if, can we give this treatment to everybody and will it lead to benefit? So that's kind of problem number one, kind of, relatively easy to solve. Kind of we do this all the time. Problem number two, how do we know the treatment actually works, right? Kind of in the visualization I showed previously, we just had a group getting kind of a treatment. But based on that alone, we can't actually know if the outcomes, we can't actually know the outcomes of both treatment or not treatment in that kind of group, in that individual. So what we need to do is we need to come up with an kind of alternative group that is not receiving that treatment so that we can monitor a group that does receive treatment and a group that does not receive treatment. There are things like crossover studies where people do get both, but we're still not measuring treatment and no treatment at the same time, right? There's still kind of a lag period. There's potential issues with spillover. So the general approach, again, is just to compare those with treatment to those without in our sample. Again, we could do this through things like crossovers. We could do things like different samples. And then we use statistics to model the effect in that overall population, right? So kind of going back to this example and trying to, very deliberately set up the next problem and next solution for the why we do clinical trials or randomized clinical trials. Suppose we have two different groups we sampled, one that receives treatment and one that receives control. And visually, I won't force anybody to come up with a response, but hopefully we can just look at these two different compositions of these two groups, and hopefully we're noticing something that kind of sticks out between kind of the treatment group and the control group here. And that's that, the people in the control group have a lot more canes in their pictures than the people in the treatment group, right? A very crude way to illustrate this idea that, perhaps the control group is, in this case, maybe it's older than the treatment group. Maybe there's some kind of something inherently different between these two groups. So that if we just sample people from the general population that have treatment and those that don't, we may introduce some differences in these two cohorts. So that leads to kind of problem number 3, right? How do we know something else isn't causing this effect? And again, in the visualization before, how do we know it's the treatment that has an effect? How do we know it's not something like age? Maybe people who are younger tend to have better outcomes, and they also tend to seek out kind of more novel treatments. Does that mean the treatment's working? Not necessarily. Maybe because they're younger, they're going to get better no matter what. They just happen to be the kind of population that seeks out that treatment. So, could other factors be causing both treatment selection and outcomes? In this case, in that visualization, could it be age? So the solution at a very big picture level is just to make sure we balance all other factors between two groups, right? If we make sure that the groups are balanced on age, sex, race, burn severity, anything like that, the impact of these factors will occur equally in both groups. So one group's not going to see more of an age impact. One group's not going to see more of a race impact, sex impact, burn severity impact. They're going to be equal between two groups. So that means that only difference that's kind of left between them can be attributed to treatment, right? So the idea is, we want these balanced groups. And that's kind of finally where this actual randomization component comes into play. If we can randomize people to treatment in control groups, we can essentially achieve this balance, or at least get very, very close. And this is, I'm not going to, drive this home too much, but this is kind of an important limitation of randomization too, and that it's sort of an to infinity and beyond kind of solution, right? If we can ensure that we can sample, infinity people and randomize them, we're going to get this perfect balance. But any finite sample study, there may be some differences that still occur in these two groups by chance, which is often why we kind of look at things like a table 1 with demographics comparing the treatment and controls to see if there are any kind of residual differences that may still occur even though we did randomization. But again, big picture goal of all this, randomization is really meant to balance kind of every possible factor out there such that any difference between groups is solely attributed to that treatment effect, right? So in this kind of this final example, we now have a treatment group and we have a control group, and at least as best we can, these pictures are matched up as closely as we can. There very well maybe some kind of hidden characteristics that we can't see, but at least visually, these two groups are essentially a perfect match and perfect mirrors of each other. It's just that one receives treatment and one of them does not. And now we can now apply statistics to make some conclusion about the treatment effect in our sample and apply it to the broader population and make that connection of, is this a treatment that should be used widespread or not? Randomization, it really helps us eliminate the association between treatment and other characteristics by design, right? This randomization is done to eliminate that association. Once that association is gone, we can no longer have any confounding. It's not present. We need that association between treatment and those other factors for confounding to be there. So once we break that kind of chain, confounding is no longer there. Again, at least in theory, as good as our randomization does for finite samples. And now any estimate of that treatment effect is going to be that true estimate of that treatment effect and is not going to be attributed to any potential confounders, again, because we have eliminated all confounders by design. So, that's great for randomized kind of, trials. But often we have observational data. And this could be because randomized trials are not always appropriate, right? There are many questions we want to answer where it would just be unethical to kind of force a randomized trial on people. And a perfect example of this is trying to identify if smoking could cause cancer, right? We can't just take two kind of healthy cohorts of individuals and randomize one group and force them to smoke for their life to see if they develop cancer, right? We can't induce that potential harm on individuals. So, ethically, we can't do kind of a randomized trial on smoking. And in many cases, it could just be kind of impractical as well. It can be very costly and time consuming to do a clinical trial. Observational trial, I can just survey people and say, like, do you smoke? Do you not? Like, do you have cancer? Do you not? And that might not be a perfect reflection of what's going to happen kind of long term for these individuals. But that TX takes, like one day and I can send out kind of the survey and get, in theory, thousands of responses. Where if I wanted to start a clinical trial on this, I randomize people. That takes a while to set up. I then have to, choose who's going to smoke, who's not going to smoke. I then have to then follow them up for, 10, 20, 30 years to see if anything happens. It's a very time consuming kind of process. So that there could be, other constraints other than just whether it's ethical or not for why we choose observational data. And certainly from just a practical research perspective, there's lots of observational data sets already out there, already collected that we can already use, right? Kind of the work's been done to collect this data. And it's kind of a shame that that data is just sitting there, just kind of being unused or used for only one single analysis. So observational studies, again, kind of, talked about this already, but essentially can avoid a lot of these issues, at least if they're done, appropriately. But they often have, or they pretty much always have shortcomings of their own, one of which being kind of this potential kind of imbalance of factors that we have. So just kind of going through the same three problems we identified for the clinical trials. I want to go through those same three problems for the observational studies and kind of point out where kind of the issue occurs, which I kind of led it already, but occurs with that balancing of characteristics. Observational studies, generally they use a sample of the target population. So that's kind of that solution for number one. We can't necessarily treat or kind of sample everybody. In observational studies, there is at least the possibility of potentially sampling everybody. In theory, right, the US Census should be able to capture kind of everybody, and we have perfect information on the exact breakdown of kind of all the factors that the census collects. In practice, obviously there's issues with kind of the return rates, who's kind of completing the survey. There's all kinds of things that complicate that narrative. But certainly in a perfect world with kind of perfect response rate and everybody, gets the survey that's supposed to have it, an observational study allows for the possibility of perfect information on a kind of population. But, in the vast majority of cases, we're dealing with just a sample of that target population. The second problem that we saw when kind of trying to work through the development of a randomized clinical trial was we need the ability to compare groups with and without treatment, right? And this is pretty easily done in observational data as well, right? You just record, okay, did you get the treatment? Did you not? Did you have the exposure? Did you not? Were you a smoker? Were you not? Did you go to rehab? Did you not? That's pretty easy to record. So we can kind of collect that information and analyze that as we want. So we have kind of a nice clean solution for problem number two as well. But it's really problem number three where the observational kind of data breaks down, right? There's nothing in collecting observational data that ensures we have a balance of other characteristics, right? So the solution for problem three that we used kind of for randomized trials is not valid, right? We can't randomize people, otherwise we're not doing an observational study anymore. So we can't guarantee that there's going to be a balance of these other characteristics. So we need to come up with some kind of new solution to try to achieve this balance of characteristics such that we can emulate kind of the clinical trial setting. As I said, we really cannot use randomization to balance characteristics. Otherwise, we're not an observational study anymore. But are there alternative methods that we can use to achieve balances? And this is where we kind of enter this idea of quasi-randomized designs, right? What we're trying to do is create the same balance that could be achieved as if we had randomized our data. There are two kind of broad general approaches to this: matching and model adjustment. I'm not going to get down in kind of the weeds of these or kind of the statistical, properties specific of these, but I did want to at least give some kind of broader overview for how these at least conceptually work and maybe where some of their limitations lie. So the first one I'm going to talk about is matching. And, kind of in its simplest description, we're just trying to find a participant with a treatment and a participant who's in the control group who have similar characteristics. Ideally, there are two identical people. If we could have identical twins, they'd kind of be as close as we could get to the perfect match here. So we can do kind of a direct match where we look at, I want to find somebody who has the exact same age or at least close, same sex, same race, same bird size, and the same location of the burn, et cetera, and kind of go on and try to match perfectly with somebody else. And this is really nice because it ensures that the groups are directly comparable. They have the exact same age, they have the exact same sex, they have the exact same race. We know they do not differ on any of those characteristics that we can match for. But it can get kind of prohibitively difficult to find a match very, very quickly if we're using kind of, more than just a few characteristics. Particularly if our control group and our treatment group are kind of similar in size, if it's about like 100 to 110, the fact that we can find perfect matches for all 100 treatment people in the 110 control group is going to be very, very difficult if we're matching on more than just like one or two characteristics. And even that might not be possible. So, while this is nice, you can quickly come into some very notable barriers, particularly if you don't have a very strong imbalance. If your treatment group is 50 and your control group is 50,000, well, then you have a lot more people to try to match for. Maybe you can add in a few more characteristics. But there are alternative ways to match as well. And one of those is using this idea of propensity scores. So a propensity score is basically just, if we turned off the treatment and control assignment, we fit a model that tries to predict whether somebody received treatment or not. So I find, this person, I think they have a 10% chance that they sought out treatment. And then I look, did they receive treatment or not? And I find somebody who did receive treatment and somebody who didn't receive treatment, who both had kind of my prediction of 10% chance of receiving probability, and I consider them now kind of a match. So I'm matching based on that probability rather than the actual characteristics of those participants. This is great because once we start kind of modeling prediction and stuff, we can toss all kinds of things in that model. We're not limited by just one or two factors. We could toss in, 20 factors. We're still somewhat limited by our sample size, but we have a lot more flexibility. The downside to this is we're just matching on predicted probability. We're not guaranteed that the ages are going to be the same, or the sex is going to be the same, or the race is going to be the same. If two things are kind of working in opposite directions, maybe people with larger burn sizes are more likely to receive treatment, but people who are older are less likely to receive treatment. So we might get somebody who's old with a large burn size have the same probability of treatment as somebody who's young, who has kind of a smaller burn size. And those different characteristics could potentially introduce some kind of residual confounding there. But kind of regardless of the approach, once the match is made, we essentially have achieved quasi-randomization, or at least the best we can based on our matching approach. And now we can just analyze the data as if they were randomized, right? We've effectively, assuming everything kind of works great, we've effectively balanced our two arms as if we had randomized those individuals. And we can now go ahead with our typical kind of analysis, and any conclusions we make, we can to some degree at least attribute to the treatment or exposure. Now, it is really important to note that this is only as good as the matchmaking is, right? So, one was the matchmaking method correct, right? So all of these methods are making some kind of assumption on the relationship between kind of individuals and the treatment and kind of the outcome. For fitting propensity scores, we now have regression models that has its own set of assumptions. And a lot of these assumptions cannot be verified. They're just assumptions we're kind of making on this underlying theoretical model. So we never actually know if the matchmaking method is necessarily correct or not. So we always have kind of that asterisk next to it. The big one that's almost always a guaranteed limitation is were all necessary characteristics included. Sometimes we can capture some of the big characteristics, but it's pretty rare to have a data set where we think, every possible confounder was included in that data set. So we're almost guaranteed that there's going to be some residual confounding in this. We can match on what we have available. We can match on what we think is going to be impactful, but there's always a chance that there are other characteristics we don't have, or there are other characteristics that we didn't think were impactful, but ended up being quite impactful on that population. And again, that stuff we often are not able to detect. It just ends up being kind of a limitation of the assumptions we have to make for that model. And with that, it kind of says at the start that, that we're not going to have any kind of, true emulation of randomization. Again, we're never going to achieve that same balance as randomization because of these potential limitations, because of the residual confounding, because we're not sure exactly what characteristics, there we go, we need to include. But the hope is that with this matching, we're at least approaching that. We're getting much, much closer to randomization than we would have been if we just kind of tossed things in without that kind of matching or critical thinking. The next step, I shouldn't say next step, but one of the alternative options, and sometimes they're used together, is covariate adjustment. So rather than explicitly matching on individuals, we're essentially trying to model the effect of these covariates and model out the impact they have. So we're not going to match on age, but we're going to try to understand what the impact of age is and essentially incorporate that into the model such that we remove the effect of age from the treatment effect. Um, so we can identify kind of any, imbalanced characteristics we have. If we kind of toss them in the regression model with treatment, again, we're effectively pulling out the impact that those characteristics have on the treatment to outcome effect, and we're left with just this isolated effect of the treatment on the outcome because everything else has been modeled out in the regression kind of model. So we're not matching, but we're achieving the same idea of we're still trying to isolate that treatment effect by adjusting out the impact of other characteristics and trying to compare individuals who are similar on those characteristics. Um, this is really nice because it can be modeled even if there's very large imbalance present in characteristics. So if you think if there's a very, very large imbalance in something like sex between our treatment and control group, it could be hard again to kind of find the necessary matches between those two groups. So the matching kind of break down and say, okay, we can't match based on sex because we don't have enough, men or women in one group compared to the other group that we have. This isn't an issue for linear regression, at least not in terms of tossing into the model and it runs, right? So we can still toss in sex in that case into a regression model, and that model will still run. We can still include kind of everybody in that model, and we can still get kind of valid outcomes. Now, you're still making some assumptions on how sex is going to work in the model. So you're opening yourself up to kind of a new set of criticisms, but at least you're not having to kind of throw out data in that context. You're able to use that full population. Um, as I kind of said with regression, there's all kinds of assumptions that underlie these regression models as well. And kind of the validity of any results relies on these assumptions being at least, accurate approximations of what's actually going on. There's a classic saying from a statistician that all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? We know we're not capturing the complexity that occurs in the real world, but the help is that through these models, we're capturing enough of that complexity and enough of the true trends that these models are still useful. And even if we can't get the perfect treatment effect estimate, we're at least getting one that's close enough to be impactful on people's lives. So, just kind of some considerations for this, quasi-randomization, and this goes for regardless of the approach we're using, but just quasi-randomization as a broad family of kind of approaches is really a design that's in a theoretical framework. I think there's this temptation to kind of say, okay, we can just use quasi-randomization, apply some statistics, boom, done. But this really requires kind of an in-depth analysis of what we're trying to do and what we think relationships are. The first thing we have to really establish is that the treatment is even plausibly related and can cause the outcome, right? I mean, if we don't have this, even if we find an association, we still can't leap to that causal outcome that we want from a clinical trial. So we need to really kind of develop, we don't know if the treatment necessarily causes the outcome, but that there's at least plausibility there, right? We can come up with kind of a clinical reason why we think this treatment should affect the outcome. And absolutely, we need to make sure that when we're measuring this, the outcome occurs after the treatment, right? If we measure them simultaneously, there's no way to conclude that that treatment is actually causing that outcome. We need to have some sort of temporal gap between those two, and a temporal gap that makes sense with how fast we think that treatment would work, right? Is this treatment expected to work within a day? Well, then we can measure outcome in the next day. Could it take a couple months for the treatment to work? And then we need to wait a few months before we kind of use that observational data for the outcome. So this needs to be established, and this needs to be established kind of theoretically that this treatment can plausibly cause the outcome. And again, you absolutely need that temporal kind of chronological trend of treatment first, outcome measured later, if you want to establish that kind of causal connection that we're aiming for in quasi-randomized approaches. We also really need to consider a priori what factors may be kind of confounders, right? It's crucial to have this kind of theoretical model going into this based on kind of the knowledge we have at this moment, right? Based on prior research or just based on, clinical experience, your interactions with people, what other factors could be at play here and why do you think those factors are at play? And everybody might have kind of a slightly different twist on what they think impacts and how it does. And that's why it's really important to establish this theoretical model a priori. You can say, this is the model, the theoretical model I want to kind of try to understand. And you might disagree with where this component goes or this component goes, but this is the model I'm going to use, and I'm going to try to I'm use the data to try to back up this model and see if it's a good fit or not. And then lastly, we have this nice theoretical model, and I think hopefully this theoretical model, if you're not familiar with this kind of approach, becomes a little more clear as we work through examples. But the last part is to always ensure that the statistical method then matches that theoretical framework, right? We have this kind of nice setup for the question we want answered, how we think things are going to impact things, and then we use statistics to kind of make conclusions based on our data to kind of match that data to the theoretical framework. And it's important to note that caution is going to be needed on really building this statistical model. I think there's a temptation to kind of just say, like, oh, we have all these potential confounders, toss them in, kitchen sink approach, just throw everything in. That way we don't have to worry about any confounding. We can just throw everything in. But you can actually lead to some very kind of, say, misleading results if we don't critically think about what characteristics should kind of be put into our model. And if we only just include characteristics based on their kind of a data-driven approach where we just look at, are there differences in the two groups for these confounders? Yes, include them. No, not. We can run into some issues. And I think this is kind of a perfect example of the issues you can run in if you get kind of a little bit too much on that hype train of like tossing in kind of variables to adjust for if you worried there might be differences. So this is a common paradox that's often kind of discussed in the statistical world, but it's this idea of this kind of this birth weight paradox is what they call it. But the general idea of this is that there's been research that has demonstrated that smoking during pregnancy is associated with lower mortality in low birth weight children, right? So this is real conclusions, real data, real world, not just some kind of thought example. And it really makes it look, at least at first glance, that smoking appears protective, right? So there's kind of this concern of, like the common concern is, smoking is going to increase mortality. And here we have some data to back up that at least for low birth weight children, smoking might actually be protective at a glance. But what is actually happening here? Uh, and what's happening here is that, smoking likely impacts both birth weight and mortality, right? So I think that there's this tendency to want to put birth weight into the model because we know it affects mortality, and we know that there's kind of differing birth weights based on smoking impacts. So we want to put it in the model. And we'll kind of demonstrate in a little bit kind of what's wrong with that approach. But for now, all we need to worry about is that smoking likely impacts both birth weight and mortality. And there's some kind of clear data to kind of back that up. So this is from a paper by Hernandez Diaz et al. From about 20 years ago, kind of looking at this paradox and just trying to use some data to kind of really demonstrate what's potentially happening here. So this is the birth weight, and it's they're looking at these kind of distributions for those who are smokers and those who are non-smokers. And we see that this group that was smoking during pregnancy, that whole distribution is shifted to the left, indicating that their rates of kind of lower birth weights are higher compared to those in the non-smoking group. So, it seems, more or less smoking is going to, at least on average, probably decrease the birth weight by, 500 grams or maybe 750 grams or so. So that's kind of, can be somewhat established by this. And the second one is looking at the mortality per 1,000 live births between non-smokers and smokers. So definitely on the right end, we see that smoking definitely seems to be harmful, right? So there definitely seems to be a harmful trend for kind of more normal birth weights. There seems to be a harmful effect of smoking. But if we look at the lower end for the low birth weight, we do see that the smokers, it's not a huge difference, but they do have lower rates of mortality. And again, this is data. This is true. Like this is a real trend that's present in the data. So what's actually kind of happening here, and can we dig down a little bit deeper to understand this paradox and then understand why we need to be careful and really think about theoretical models when we're trying to kind of emulate randomized trials and when we're trying to decide what to adjust for. So in this case, as we saw from the figures, among non-smokers, low weight babies tend to be kind of less rare. There's a lower rate of low weight babies in non-smokers. And it likely means that low weight babies, probably have additional other risk factors for mortality, right? There's probably some reason why this baby is low weight. Not always, but I'd say, at least at a population level, low weight baby is likely going to have other risk factors in a non-smoker. But because smoking kind of causes lower birth weights, smokers tend to have a higher rate of otherwise healthy babies who are now low weight. If they weren't smokers, that baby would have been like a normal weight. But because smoking causes the birth weight to kind of decrease, by smoking, you're taking kind of otherwise normal weight, healthy babies, and you're now putting them in the low weight category because of the effects of smoking. So we have lower rates of higher weight babies, but we have a higher rate of low birth weight babies who do not have any other kind of risk for mortality other than their mother was a smoker. So that's kind of the only risk factor they have. So by now kind of trying to compare and adjust for birth weight and compare only low weight babies, we've actually added kind of this difference to the group composure. We now know that the non-smokers, we don't know, but at least the theory is that non-smokers, low weight babies, have a lot more other risk factors for mortality than smokers. Again, because smoking is inducing lower birth weights, it's again moving essentially healthy kids into that low birth weight category when really, if they were non-smokers, they would have been in that higher group. So we now have essentially kind of a sicker population in the non-smoking group compared to a healthier population outside of the smoking in that smoking group amongst the lower birth weights. So by trying to adjust for birth weight, we actually introduced a greater difference between these two different groups. And you can kind of find these types of paradoxes all over the place. So similar conclusions can be reached when comparing mortality between male and female babies. So male infants tend to be slightly higher weight than female babies. So again, if they're the same weight, there's a greater chance that there's some other sort of health factor going on with that male infant, justifying their slightly lower weight. Which means they're going to tend to have slightly lower mortality rates at that given birth weight, even if overall the mortality rates are relatively similar between the two. So the kind of the important thing to note here, and this will be, I think, even more clear when we start looking at kind of the visual representation of this, is that the statistics provide the right answer. The answer that was kind of obtained was correct. It was just the wrong question, right? The wrong theoretical model was being used. It wasn't the question we actually wanted to answer, but based on kind of the question that was being asked, which was among low birth weight children, is smoking associated with lower or higher mortality? And it was associated with lower mortality. But if the goal is, should we recommend smoking to people who are pregnant, that's a very different question because smoking is in that causal pathway. So again, there's nothing wrong with the initial conclusion. The statistics were correct. The interpretation was correct. Among low weight babies, smoking was associated with lower mortality. That's the way the data analysis was. But again, this is the wrong question because we're completely ignoring the causal impact that smoking has on birth weight. Again, from a public health standpoint, the question of restricting to low birth weight babies is not the question we want to ask. We want to ask the question of, at the start of pregnancy, if somebody smokes or not, what is the impact on infant mortality? So it's kind of the wrong question. And again, this is just really meant to illustrate, we really need to ensure the theoretical model that we're trying to create answers the actual question that we want to answer, and we're not accidentally answering a different question. And this is where this idea of these directed acyclic graphs can be really, really helpful. These directed acyclic graphs, and we'll have some examples walking through that smoking and birth weight in a second here, but just briefly what directed acyclic graphs are, it's just a way to visually represent a theoretical clinical framework, right? So trying to identify what are different causal pathways, what factors do I have to consider, and just laying it out in a nice visual representation can be kind of helpful both kind of internally for one to make sure they fully understand the kind of the model they want, but also helpful when kind of sharing it with others so others can assess kind of the framework you're working with. It consists of these nodes, which are just kind of variables, and then paths, which are kind of the causal pathways that we think are occurring between these different variables. The name comes from directed, meaning the paths denote the direction of causality. So we're saying we're going from this variable causes this variable. Acyclic, there's no path can lead back to its starting point, at least not causally. So we're kind of on a one-way street when we're creating these graphs, which again may not perfectly represent kind of the real world out there, but the hope is that at least these graphs are at least reasonable enough crude approximations of what's happening. And I think it's important to note that these aren't necessary, right? There's nothing about directed acyclic graphs that automatically kind of improve the rigor of your research. But it is a nice framework to help you make sure you're getting kind of these pathways and questions you want answered. It's helpful for sharing your thought process with others, right? It's a useful tool for communicating and critically thinking. But if you can do this without these DAGs, then go ahead and go for it. But I think it is a really nice full tool for illustrating kind of what's occurring in these examples. So going back to that birth weight example, again, our question, at least the question I would want to answer if I was a clinician, if I was an OBGYN, would be, does smoking lead to changes in infant mortality, right? That's ultimately the question I want answered. But then somebody kind of brought up this idea of, well, what about birth weight, right? We know there's probably some relationship between birth weight and smoking. So do we need to try to account for that when we're trying to assess the impact of smoking and infant mortality, right? Essentially, is birth weight a confounder? Is what we want to kind of try to identify. If so, we should include it in the model. If it's not a confounder, we may not want to include it in the model. Um, so, first off, we're going to kind of assume it's fairly well established that birth weight is related to infant mortality, right? Individuals who tend to have lower birth weights tend to have higher infant mortality, right? Whether that's caused specifically by birth weight or some other factor that's causing them both, there's probably a myriad of explanations for that. But for the sake of this example, we're just going to assume that low birth weight is a direct cause of infant mortality, particularly low birth weights, lower infant mortality. Then the question is now, what's really this association between birth weight and smoking, right? We're fairly confident there's an association, there. But what exactly is this association? And how does that impact what we want to include in our model? So the first one is, we could think about this as, does birth weight cause people to smoke, right? Low birth weight, right? And certainly low birth weight after the birth is done does not cause people to smoke kind of prior, right? There's not kind of can't go back in time and cause that. But I suppose one could potentially make the argument of, you go to an ultrasound, you see that your child is likely on the lower end of size, you get stressed and you start smoking, right? I mean, you could come up with kind of this weird idea of causal pathway there. And if this was the case, then we would have a confounder, right? Birth weight is causing people to smoke, or at least the anticipated low birth weight is causing people to smoke, and the low birth weight is causing increases in infant mortalities, right? So if this was the theoretical model we were operating on, adjusting and controlling for birth weight is necessary to try to kind of better achieve that quasi-randomization, right? But I think you'd be hard pressed to convince a lot of people that this is actually what the kind of this model and pathway looks like, right? I think this is much more likely what people are going to think this pathway looks like, and I think this is what the data backs up to an extent too, right? Smoking leads to lower birth weights, which in turn could lead to lower infant mortality, and there's probably also some direct effect of smoking on infant mortality, or if not direct, there might be some other pathways for that. Um, and in this case, we want to be careful with adjusting for birth weight. If we adjust for birth weight, what we're essentially doing is removing that whole pathway, right? So in this case, the prominent pathway was going from smoking to birth weight to infant mortality. And by adjusting for birth weight, we basically broke in that pathway. And the only pathway we have left is this faint little connection between smoking and infant mortality. Again, this is just kind of my extreme visualization representing this. But again, we're essentially removing a pivotal causal pathway, and now we're left with the question that we're really answering is, does smoking directly impact infant mortality, ignoring every other possible pathway to get there? And I don't think, again, that's the question that we really want to answer. I think this is really the question that we want answered if we're asking if smoking impacts infant mortality. We don't necessarily care if it's a direct impact or if it's through birth weight or if it's through something else. We just want to know from the start, if somebody smokes, is it going to impact infant mortality? And because birth weight's in that causal pathway, we need to make sure we kind of don't accidentally adjust out for it. Otherwise, we lose part of that causality between smoking and infant mortality. So this isn't necessarily explicitly trying to set up kind of a quasi-randomization approach, but I think this is really meant to try to illustrate the importance of when you're thinking about these quasi-randomization approaches, you really need to critically think about how is this variable related to the other factors in my model, and should I include it or not? Because if you just kind of put things in kind of blindly or on a whim, you could end up with very kind of contradictory conclusions that are not even remotely close to the question that you actually want answered. So that's kind of the idea of DEGs, and that's kind of what we have to kind of really critically think about when we're talking about trying to set up these quasi-randomized examples. And then the last thing I want to conclude on is trying to apply this to an example from the Bird Model Systems National Database. So we're going to go through the same process, but rather than kind of just jumping to kind of these factors, we're going to go through kind of one by one, consider 4 different factors and what role they play within our model, and try to understand what should our model be at the very end to, as closely as possible, mirror that quasi-randomization approach we want. So for those of you, I think good chunk of people here are pretty familiar with the Burn model systems and the national database we have. But just very briefly, if you're not, the goal of the Burn model systems is really to collect longitudinal data on burn survivors. And it collects it from 4 burn centers at any given time, right? So these 4 burn centers can change. They're funded by grants. So kind of when grant renewals, there can be some turn over to the burn centers, but at any one time, we have 4 burn centers collecting data, and we collect data at, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, and kind of every 5 years post-discharge. So going up to 25, 30, as long as we can collect data from people, we're going to follow them up. And it's funded by the National Institute on Disability and Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research. And it's all at least primarily observational data, or at least that's the goal of it. There is room to kind of conduct trials within this database as we're collecting the data, but the kind of the database itself, right, is observational data. Anybody accessing it is not going to be able to do randomized trials on these kind of individuals. So for all practical purposes, it's completely observational database. But the question is really, right, how can we leverage this very unique and rich database, right? This is very unique in the amount of kind of longitudinal data it has, and really looking at, outcomes kind of following up on the burn. I think we've seen that for surviving the burn injury itself and kind of that acute care treatment has improved greatly, but there's just been kind of less research looking at more kind of long-term trends and long-term solutions for the challenges that burn survivors face. And this is very unique in the sense that it has a very extensive amount of longitudinal data available in it. But again, it's observational, right? We can't do kind of clinical trials on this data that's already been collected, but we may want to try to identify, what things are working for people or what things aren't working for people. And can we use that to kind of spearhead the development of, therapies, treatments, things like that, that could be rigorously tested in clinical trial setting. Oh, sorry, this is just a repeat of that. So the question I'm going to pose kind of here is, does amputation lead to worse physical function? So it's kind of supposing this is the question I want answered. And this is very kind of loosely based on a paper that has come out of this burn model systems group. Some liberties have been changed to kind of fit this into the presentation as answering kind of a slightly different question, slightly different approach. But this is, I think this would be a reasonable question to want to ask. But my follow-up to this would be, can we improve this question? What do you mean by amputation leading to worse physical function? Like, what specifically are you trying to look at? Are you trying to look at, does needing an amputation lead to worse physical function? Which I think is a very valid kind of question, but it does not necessarily attribute causality to the amputation itself, right? Somebody who needs an amputation is likely going to have kind of a more severe injury, or at least location specific injuries too, tend to be more on the arms and legs and stuff. That person is going to look different than somebody who does not need an amputation. So is that the question that you want, that this kind of person who experienced injuries such that they needed an amputation and they got the amputation, are they going to be better or worse off with physical function than somebody whose injury did not merit an amputation? Again, valid question, but we're not targeting whether the amputation had an impact or not. That tends to target more, whether was their injury the kind of the causality of that worse kind of function, and through that they had to get an amputation. So if you wanted to kind of fine tune this in a way to really get at more specifically, does the amputation itself lead to worse physical functions, or is there an alternative method that maybe works better? What we'd really want to do is look at individuals who have very similar injury, demographic, et cetera, all these different characteristics. And once all those are kind of balanced for, does amputation lead to worse physical function, right? If this was a randomized trial, what we want to do is first identify who would be kind of essentially eligible for amputation. And then we'd randomize people to, yes, you get an amputation, or no, you don't get an amputation. Maybe there's some other, treatment that we think could be as an alternative to that amputation. That would be the idea of what we'd want to do for a clinical trial. And if we can balance those groups, if we could do that trial, we can now attribute any differences between the amputation and the non-amputation group directly to that amputation, right? Once we've balanced on injury characteristics, demographics, socioeconomic status, all those things, if the only thing that's left is a difference in amputation status, any difference in physical function, 1 year down the road, we can attribute to that amputation having occurred. So let's go ahead and try to kind of critically build that model, right? So here's the question we want answered. We want to know, does the actual amputation itself lead to kind of increases or decreases in physical function, 1 year, 2 year, 5 years later? But there's all these other, we don't have a randomized trial. So we know that the amputation group and the non-amputation group are not balanced, right? There's going to be differences in characteristics. So what we need to do is identify, okay, which of these characteristics do we need to try to account for to achieve the same effect as if we had randomized individuals? So the first one we're going to consider is age. And I'm going to kind of keep going through these, but I kind of encourage everybody to kind of start thinking about, what is the relation? What do I think the relationship between age and amputation is? And what do I think the relationship between age and physical function is? Does one cause the other? Is there no relationship? That's all going to impact kind of the decision that goes into our model. So this was at least my interpretation of it. Again, I think age is probably somewhat causal with amputation. I don't know. I'm not a clinician. I don't do this for for a job. But my assumption would be probably younger people may be more likely to have an amputation. Um, though again, I could be incorrect on that. And then I think age, younger people are likely going to have higher physical function. Would also be my assumption. We can also consider burn location. I think burn location is going to be highly associated with, amputation or at least, injury location in general. I don't think, a burn on my face or chest is going to lead to an amputation, but potentially a burn on my, feet or arms could potentially lead to an amputation. And again, I think burn location could also have an impact on physical function as well. Burn severity, I certainly think burn severity is going to have impact on amputation. A very minor burn, you would not think there's going to be an amputation. A very, very severe one, could. And certainly the same with physical function. A very, minor burn is probably not going to have as big of an impact on physical function as a very severe burn, kind of all else equal. So I think there's going to be causal pathways there as well. And the last one is physical therapy. And this one, I think, has a kind of a little bit of a different pathway here. I think that amputation is probably associated with whether somebody does get physical therapy or not, kind of causally, right? Somebody who gets an amputation may be more likely to receive more physical therapy just because there's going to be kind of more work done to kind of understand how to use a prosthetic or how to kind of be ambulatory with an amputation, develop kind of new skills that you maybe wouldn't have to if you didn't have that amputation. And physical therapy is certainly going to be associated with physical function, right? I would anticipate people who have physical therapy, again, all else equal, people with physical therapy are probably going to have a higher degree of physical function down the road. So, here I have, essentially one question of interest with amputation and physical function, four other factors, and this is already getting kind of to be lines kind of everywhere. And this is why it's kind of, trying to conceptualize this in my head is really difficult, but having these DAGs and being able to illustrate them helps make this process a lot easier. And you could probably draw all kinds of other lines of associations between here. But essentially, based on these lines, I can follow pathways and understand what do I think is a confounder, what do I need to adjust for to achieve balance, and what do I need to be careful with when adjusting for, because I don't want to result in that birth weight paradox. I don't want to make it look like smoking is helpful when it's really not, because I've kind of ignored certain pathways. So in this case, because physical therapy is in that causal pathway, I do not want to include that in my model, right? I just want to know kind of from day one, amputation, I don't care what happens after. I know amputation is going to have some trickle down effect on all aspects of somebody's life. I'm not trying to pinpoint a specific pathway. I just want to know kind of accounting for after, not necessarily accounting for all those factors, but just with an amputation, does that lead to changes in physical function? I want to remove those variables from my model that are in the causal pathway so I don't accidentally adjust out the effect that amputation has on physical therapy, which in turn has on physical function. But I'm going to keep age, burn location, and severity in that model because they're causally related to amputation. There's no kind of pathway from amputation to physical function through burn severity, right? It goes the opposite direction. Same with age, it goes the opposite direction. Same with burn location, opposite direction. So there's an association there I need to account for, but I'm not worried about it being in the causal pathway. So this is kind of the model that I would end up through this kind of thought experiment. Again, kind of concluding what I showed on the previous slide, the model should include age, burn location, and burn severity based on my kind of theoretical model, right? I built that theoretical model, and now I know what to do in my statistical model. I include these as potential confounders, but I do not want to include the amount of physical therapy because it's in the causal pathway, right? Now, there might be some reasons to adjust for it, even if it's in the causal pathway, if you want pathway specific kind of causality, right? But I just want overall causal relationship between amputation and physical function. I don't care about the pathway, so I do not want to adjust for it because I do not want to remove that pathway from my model. And then I think the ultimate question, was this truly a quasi-randomized approach, right? And I'd say, probably not. There's probably notable residual confounding likely present. Right? I mean, at least in the terms of what we have in the burn model systems, we don't have things like depth of burn and things like that. So like we're missing likely key characteristics for burn severity. This one, and then the model I presented, there weren't other factors that could be impactful as well. So, this likely hasn't really achieved a true quasi-randomized, scenario. We're limited by our data. We're limited by kind of what we answer. But I think the idea is correct. And the idea of trying to think through this as if we're trying to achieve a quasi-randomized approach think this helps kind of strengthen the analysis that we do. So even if we can't make that full achievement of, oh, we're almost at the equivalent of randomized clinical trial, we're at least following the same theoretical framework to critically think about what we want to answer, how we want to answer it, and we're building a model that's kind of the best that model can be to answer the specific question that we want. So just a quick summary of kind of the overall kind of talk and hopefully what we've gained from this. The first one is just that, randomization really ensures treatment effects can be estimated and not the result of other characteristics, right? We're achieving this by balancing all characteristics between the groups such that there can be no differing effects in one group for the other than the effect of treatment in the group that receives that. Quasi-randomization method is kind of the way of trying to make lemonade out of lemons. It can be used for observational data. And what it does is it tries to balance out characteristics between the treatment groups as if we had randomized our population or a sample. Often this is limited by residual confounding. So I don't know if I've ever been fully convinced that we've achieved kind of perfect quasi-randomization. But a good example of this that I think has been, achieved to agree is the relationship between smoking and cancer, right? There has been no clinical trials in humans that show that, smoking is going to give you, increased risk of lung cancer. But the amount of data that they've kind of collected on this and the amount of things they tried to account for, like things like age and things, these models, they pulled out as much of this kind of confounding that they have, and there's still this association there that the logical conclusion is, yeah, there might be some residual confounding, but that residual confounding is not going to be enough to explain why people who smoke still have higher rates of cancer, right? So it's not this definitive randomized trial, but we've essentially gotten kind of as close as we can to that randomized trial, such that we think there's really no other, at least no other large factor that could be impacting that relationship. But kind of regardless of whether you're truly in a quasi-randomized setting or not, it's really important to identify a clear theoretical model and build up this model as if you were approaching it through kind of this quasi-randomization and trying to identify the pathways and trying to figure out what you need to balance and what you might want to be cautious when you're trying to balance those variables. Because that kind of what helps determine what what characteristics to include in the model. And the DAGs, those directed acyclic graphs, can be really helpful with this process, right? It's just a framework to help kind of think through things critically and be able to share that critical thought process with others. It's also a way where somebody can check your theoretical model with your statistical model to make sure those match up. So it's kind of helpful in that approach as well. But there's nothing kind of magical about a DAG approach that's going to solve your problems. It's just going to help you critically think about them. Questions. I know I
Thanks,
didn't leave a
Andrew.
ton of time, but got a few minutes here.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. Do you want to scan them or do you want me to read them?
I'm happy to give them a scan.
Okay.
So also I'll just kind of read them out too for their sake of recording. With BMS data, we're limited to different demographic injury characteristics that we collect. Is it possible to adjust for confounding outside of the variables we collect? If we had sound conceptual model based off BMS variables, is there a way to calculate strength, rigidity of said model, and how much it is resistant to outside factors? I'd say not really statistically, or I'd say right, like I think we can kind of think conceptually in this theoretical framework, okay, well, we know we don't have this variable here and we don't have this variable here. And maybe other previous work has showed the relationship between variable A and variable B is this strong, and between B and C it's this strong. Therefore, we kind of think we're kind of missing kind of out on it. But I'd say ultimately we're in a statistical sense, we're limited by the data that we have. I think, one potential way some of the moving to larger kind of data-driven, I hate to use AI because AI is really just kind of statistics behind the scenes for large kind of data sets. But one way where some of that could be leveraged in this approach is to potentially use the characteristics we have in a different study approach to try to predict, the characteristics we have. Can we use these to try to predict characteristics we don't have, and from there try to identify, okay, these variables predict this variable predicts this. Can we somehow kind of factor that in? But I think that's kind of getting outside the scope of the BMS itself, because you still need that additional data set to try to link characteristics that we do have to characteristics we don't have. So I think it would sort of be a multi-stage, multi-database process to try to get anywhere near that statistically. But I think conceptually, we can certainly kind of create these models and identify, here's our missing component that we don't have. Here's how we think it may impact that model. I have another question here. If a BMS module prospectively captured acute burn care exposures, their indications, timing, and confounders alongside BMS longitudinal data, could these data support target trial emulation to estimate causal effects of specific acute treatment on long-term recovery? Let me just take me a few seconds to just kind of go over that again myself. Yeah, so I think as long as right, I think there's still the potential, right? There's always gonna be a potential issue of missing out on residual confounding, right? I think we think we can capture the confounding the best we can, but we're possibly missing something. So the nice thing about randomization is it balances everything, even things we don't think about, at least theoretically. So I would say we would get very close to the ability to kind of capture and estimate causal effects. But I'd say kind of anytime we're not doing a randomized trial, there's probably going to be asterisks of the possibility of residual confounding still available. So I think the more airtight you can identify those confounders, the stronger justification you have for concluding it. But I don't think you're ever going to be 100% kind of perfect there. And yeah, a lot of dice to talk to. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it'd be a lot of lines and a lot to kind of keep track. But I think it's a good aim to strive for, right? When we kind of do research, even if we're not 100% there, getting 99% of there is better than 50% of the way there. So I think even if we're never going to perfectly kind of attribute causality in some of these settings, I think the more we can kind of critically think about these, the closer we'll be, and that's only going to be a benefit for science, even if we can't, 100% of the way get there.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was really good, really helpful for me too. I think we might be out of time. We might not have enough time for another question, but yeah, thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Andrew. And I look forward to our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.
My pleasure. And yeah, thank you all for attending.
Bye.